Welcome to ThinkTech Tech Talks on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about creating networks for the universe using space for universal access. Our guest for the show is Candace Johnson. She's with Seraphim Space Fund and also about 20 other space organizations, which we don't have time to list today. If we had a much longer show, we could list them, but I think it's more important that we hear from Candace. You know, space and satellite development and related hardware and software technologies, especially AI, are clearly the way to the future for the global community and for each of us. And we need to understand and keep up with all of these things. So, Candace, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you here.
Aloha, and it's so great to be back. I'm here on the islands for my 55th class reunion from Punahou, and it's just been such a joy to, you know, discover and rediscover the Aloha spirit. And thank you so much for inviting me onto your show.
Well, you have slides, you make presentations hither and yon around the world. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to go through your presentation today so we can get the background on what you do, okay?
Wonderful. That's lovely. So, you know, today space is really related to everything. And that's why I'm so happy to be speaking on this show. And it's basically a lot of people don't really understand, but the biggest thing is the IoT, the fact that we can put sensors on everything, on animals, on plants, on humans, on buildings. And we can use space and satellites to gather all of that data and to bring it down and to analyze it with AI. So, that is one way. But also, whether it be the environment, the climate, finance, people don't realize every single time you do an electronic, financial transaction, you are using the GPS satellite system that you use to do your driving. Defense, Ukraine is the world's first space enabled war. And so we have to talk about that and we have to realize this. And then we have everything that's going on in what I call space in space. So space stations, robotics, asteroids, etc. And then, you've talked about AI, but actually, I'm kind of a step ahead, very much into quantum, which I think is really the fundamental technology for space. And also, it works perfectly with space because it is the best way to have a secure network. So, what we call QKD, quantum key distribution, is best done over satellite networks, not over fiber, but over space networks. And of course, then my dear friend, Vint Cerf, the father of the internet, he's always talking to me, Candace, we must promote positive digital transformation. And I think it's also very important in this day when we are talking about geopolitical, issues to realize that space has always been a product of international cooperation and collaboration. And you first had Sputnik, you had the space race, but you had a very kind of, positive competition going on. You had government related satellites, Intelsat, Inmarsat. You had SES, the company that I founded, which was doing for the first time ever a private transporter telecommunications company based in Europe. You had Iridium. I'm very fortunate to have also been on the founding team of Iridium, which is the precursor of Starlink, of OneWeb, etc. You have teleports. We have a teleport here in Hawaii. Well, I started the first private satellite telecommunications teleport in Europe right after the wall fell down and companies needed to have corporate networks. You have the space station. You have scientific missions. You have the Artemis Accords. We now have 69 countries who have joined the Artemis Accords for international collaboration. And the James Webb Telescope, that is perhaps the most beautiful example of international collaboration. So space is definitely like water, like the oceans. And we'll be having the UN Oceans conference next week in Nice, in France, which is my second home. And it is the way that you bring people and humanity together. And since we're talking about the James Webb Telescope, one of the most beautiful things is that beforehand we used to talk about deep space, we used to talk about near space, and then we would talk about the planet Earth. And because of the findings of the James Webb Telescope, we are able to really understand the origins of our being, of our universe, and to have it all be harmonious. And this is something very exciting. Now, you might ask, Candace, how did you get into this? Well, you won't believe it, but in 1957, when I was 5 years old, I did not receive this is an absolute replica of the Sputnik, but I received this. So in the middle there, you can see there's a kind of like flying saucer with Santa Claus inside. That's what I received to put on my Christmas tree when I was 5 years old. And from then on, everything that was good as far as I was concerned came from space. So I always tell parents, be careful about the presents that you give your children because you never know what they're going to end up doing. And you might say, well, why did your parents give you a toy Sputnik? Well, my father, who was here during the Vietnam War, he was the general of the all of the telecommunication networks for the military. And at that time, we were living in France and he was doing telecommunications. And so, when Le Sputnik arrived in Paris, then everybody was, ah. And so I got that little toy. And I really do believe that everything that good comes from space. And today, because of the fact that we really have to have global telecommunications, connectivity, interactivity, interconnectivity, we really need to have space as the glue for the whole digital transformation. And so when I first started out, I was 19, my gosh, well, I was about 25 years old when I did my first satellite network in the United States. I'm a classical musician. And so I decided that we needed to put my classical music radio station, which at that time was WGMS, Washington's Good Music Station, to not have it just be for Washingtonians, but to have it be across the nation. And so I put that radio station on space, on satellite, actually doing the first superstation before Ted Turner. And then when I was 28, I married the ambassador of Luxembourg to the United States. Now you may say, Candace, why is that important? Well, Luxembourg, which we will see, is a very, very little country in the middle of Europe. And in 1982, they were having a broadcast crisis, a steel crisis, and a monetary union crisis with Belgium. And the prime minister, the father of the euro, Pierre Werner, was looking for a fourth economic pillar. And so I told him, I said, Mr. Werner, Luxembourg could have a satellite system. And sure enough, that is what we did. So so that was 1983 when I came to Luxembourg. Now you see that map. Well, between France and Germany and Belgium is Luxembourg, 400,000 people. This was the coverage zone that we had planned to create Astra. Astra was the trademark, and SES, Société Européenne des Satellites, was the company name. Now, imagine this coverage zone, 1983, was not the way that most people saw Europe at that time. They saw Eastern Europe and they saw Western Europe, and they didn't see that it could be all brought together. And so that is why I say that from the very beginning, I was using space to create universal access. And in this particular instance, 1983, freedom of choice, freedom of choice. So we can fast forward, and ladies who are in the audience, um, it does get better. But at the time, I was the only woman. So there I am in the middle, you know, and very, very immodestly, all of the people in that picture. The Grand Duke of Luxembourg is over to my. Let me see. Well, let me see. To your right, the very good-looking young man in the white shirt. The Prime Minister, Mr. Werner, with the white hair, is behind him. And all of them were in Kourou. So that was in Arianespace, French Guiana, to launch my satellite system, December 12th, 1988. It took us 5 years, but we did it. Now, the beautiful thing, really beautiful, which we didn't plan, but we did have this idea of the freedom of choice, of universal access, was that 11 months later, the wall fell down, and we were the only satellite system in the world to be able to cover both Eastern and Western Europe. Now, that is exciting. That is what the power of space is and the power of entrepreneurship. And then, it's one thing to become number one, but it's another thing to stay number one. And so in 2000, I architected that this little country from Luxembourg, that we would buy GE Americom from the United States, and that we would create the world's largest satellite system, which we did in 2001. And talking about international collaboration, in 1995, when the wall had fallen down and the COCOM rules that did not allow Western technology to be used or transferred to Eastern technology, in 1995, I created ILS, International Launch Services, and we became, you can see the logo, the Astra logo on top of that rocket. April 9th, 1995, we became the first Occidental satellite to ever be launched on a Russian launcher. And so, this is why I do believe that space is good. Everything good comes from space. And it really is international collaboration. And, then I went on to create Teleport Europe, indeed. So, those teleports that I was talking about, so that the European companies who were trying to work with the Eastern European companies, but they didn't have any networks. And so we provide instant infrastructure. Satellites provide instant infrastructure, and they can be connected to just about anything. And so I did that Teleport Europe. I started it in Hanover, Germany. It got bought by L'Oreal, but I kept 1%. You call me the 1% woman. And in 1994, I created Europe Online, the world's first internet based online service. And then in 1997, I put it again on satellite because that was the way to get internet to to everybody. And so, people talk and say, oh, Elon Musk, etc. I kind of yawn because, quite frankly, I have been doing broadband internet via satellite for 25 years at least. And in 1994 as well, I became the founding team member of Iridium. So, that satellite architecture that you see there, those are low Earth orbit satellites, and they really are the precursors of OneWeb and of Starlink. Again, I kind of yawn because here we were doing satellite mobile telephony when we launched it in 1998, and we are still very much doing that. But we've gone on to do the Internet of Things, and then just to really kind of go from so doing giving using satellites to provide universal access to then accessing the universe, because that's the important thing now, where we need to have satellite systems that basically can help us with our Earth observation, with our oceans, with our climate change. And of course, satellites can do all of this, and they can monitor, unfortunately, the bad things, with carbon and the and the warming of the earth. But we are hoping that by getting all of that data and applying AI to that data, that we will have what I call actionable insights. I don't call AI artificial intelligence. I call it actionable insights. And I think that that is something that is very important. And, then if we go now to the networks for the universe. So, you know, it's we will go to the universe, but I want to make it very clear. Everything that I do in space exploration, in going to the moon, maybe eventually to Mars, is for Mothership Earth, for our life on Mothership Earth. And I'm also, as Jay pointed out, I'm also the founding president of Seraphim Space Tech, which is the world's largest space tech venture fund. I'm also an angel investor. So, you have Chenoa Farnsworth here in the islands, doing the angel investing. And this is one of my angel investments. Another woman, please. Um, she is building Europe's first spaceship. Okay. So, here again, she's just being an Elon Musk, if you want, but she's doing her own spaceship. She raised $180 million last year, and she is, she's going to town. Another woman who I've also invested in is a woman named Barbara Belvisi, and she is building pods that can grow plants on Earth and also on the moon and in Mars. And she won the NASA Deep Space Food Challenge, a young French woman, very exciting. And then, of course, when we are talking, and I promise you, I'm just about ready in 2 minutes, we need to bring high throughput broadband internet to all of our Pacific islands. And so in 2013, I helped create a company called Pacific. And we are, as you can see, it's like almost like we're giving every single island nation their own satellite, but we're doing it with very focused beams so that they all have a dedicated bandwidth, which is also very important. We're geostationary, but we have dedicated bandwidth. So it's very reliable, very resilient. It is not shared bandwidth like Starlink. And here again, I put together a group of women, Oceania Women's Network Satellite, and we financed this Pacific satellite system. So, the, what is kind of next on the horizon for these networks for the universe? So these are logistic networks. They're transport networks, like my friend who's doing the space station, the spaceship. They're food networks, like with Interstellar Lab, and we're also doing energy networks. So I'm working on a project where we will literally, bring all of the sun's energy, we'll concentrate it, we'll bring it down to the earth via microwave, and we'll put it in the grid. And in 2040, we hope that we will be able to provide 20% of the world's energy needs. And another thing that I'm doing right now are moon data centers. So putting data centers on the moon so that we don't have to use all of that energy to cool all of these huge data centers. We can put them on the moon and we can bring them down. So, that's a little bit of what I do and have done. But, the future really belongs to the next generation. And that is why I work so hard to hopefully inspire young people to go into space, to use space to create something beautiful and something meaningful and impactful for Mothership Earth.
Wow. Okay, why don't you turn off the slides and we'll get
Great.
into some Q&A. I'm
Good.
so excited to be able to ask you some Q&A.
Great.
So, God, you're a dream come true. Where did you learn to speak French? Luxembourg, they speak French, and France, they obviously speak French. And you have to be very good at French to do what you do.
I always tell everybody I'm the luckiest person in the world, and I really do believe that. And when I was being given my little toy Sputnik, my parents were living in France, My dad was working at SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. So I grew up speaking French. My husband, my very cute, darling husband who's no longer with us, but he's in, up in that space. He always said, because I said, why don't you speak German with me? Because I needed to speak German as well. And he goes, mais Candice, Français, c'est la langue de l'amour. French is the language of love. What can you say to that? So,
Yes, absolutely. So you have to know a lot about technology. You have to know a lot about electronics. You have to know about physics,
yeah.
and a bunch of other science and technology subjects. Where did you pick that up? Did you study at Punahou to get started?
Uh, no. No, I have 5 degrees in music. I have no degrees in physics, in science, in math, in business. And yet, I am creating many, many companies. But you know what? I didn't have to learn it. I grew up with it, you know. And so a lot of people say, and this is a little bit immodest, but it is true that, you know, I helped shape what we call space today. And of course, I was learning from the masters. So, when I was 6, I built my own little transistor radio station. When I was 8, my best friend was 60. He was one of the founders of Northrop Grumman, and he had the largest ham radio station. And every Sunday, I would go to his house, and we would call around the world. When you're 8 years old and you get that buzz from the communications and realizing that you can speak with anybody. And when I was 10, my dad had been lent from the Air Force to the White House, and he came to my fifth grade class and he said, we will have satellites for telecommunications, for entertainment, for education. And when we have wars, this is 1962, we will have wars with satellites and we will have peace on Earth. Well, he got the wars with satellites right, but unfortunately, we're still striving to have peace on Earth. But I do believe that space will enable us to also have peace on Earth. And so I think this also very important is that so when I growing up in this family and people would come to our house, Werner von Braun came to our house. Vint Cerf, the father of the internet, came to our house. Um, Paul Barron, father of the X.25 network, he would come to our house and we would listen. The children were allowed to sit on the steps and listen, to these great minds talk about what technology was doing. And when you're that young and you get to learn all of this and you have friends who you can talk to and say, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about this? When you're older, that is great. But it also teaches you that technology is just a tool and that the most important thing is to serve humanity. This is the most important thing.
Amen to that. So, I've attended the PTC, Pacific Telecommunications Conference Council.
Yes,
David Lasner, former the president of UH, was always there, and you've attended the same meetings. And
yes.
I wonder what you think of PTC. What role does it play? As a matter of fact, let me go further. What role does Hawaii play, in developing satellite communications and technology?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I have been a guest, I've been speaker at PTC. I love to come to PTC. I think everybody loves to come to PTC. And my father, when he was so this is 1968 to 1970, which was the time that I was at Punahou. I was only there for 2 years, but I do consider my time at Punahou and my time in Hawaii to have been the most formative years of my life, and I'm tremendously thankful. And so after I graduated, my father retired from the United States Air Force. There were 4 kids that he had to put through college. And even though he was a general, a general salary doesn't go very far to put 4 kids through college. And he went to Western Union to start the world's first private satellite system, so Westar. And of all things, he put the first teleport here in Hawaii for Western Union, and he did it at Barbers Point, and so it was a teleport right away. The Pacific that I'm talking about, the Oceania Women's Network satellite, that Pacific, we also have a teleport here. So the Hawaii is a perfect launch pad, literally and figuratively, for satellites. Now, for many many years, the PTC has focused on cable, on submarine cable. And it was very difficult for some of us in the space community, to get people to get their hands around or heads around the fact that satellite and cable can and should coexist. When I was doing the Astra satellite for satellite television, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, is it cable or is it satellite?" And I said, if you have a possibility to have a cable network at home, then of course you use that cable network. But if you don't have the possibility to have a cable network at home, then you use a direct satellite television dish. And increasingly, what then happened, though, was that people more and more realized that the cable networks were kind of dictating what they wanted the people to watch. Whereas if you had your own satellite dish, you were totally free. And it's the same thing also with telecommunications. But with cable and submarine cable and satellites, we are a backup for the submarine cable. And where the submarine cable, I was speaking with the World Bank just this morning. You have to go from point to point with a cable. With satellite, you can of course go everywhere. And so for outer islands, for places that it's very difficult to lay cable. My wonderful little last satellite communication system, Pacific, twice we have helped Tonga when their fiber optic cable broke, and we were providing the telecommunications for all of those, for the entire country of Tonga. So, it's really a marriage made in heaven, and we should use both of them. Also, if you have fiber optic that is feeding into your satellite system, it will, of course, be much better. So it's really not a question of either or; it's a question of both.
Now, I do remember, though, in my visits to PTC, that at least at that time, satellites were more expensive than cable. On the other hand, you have to recognize that cable deteriorates, and over time, you have to replace it and you have to repair it, which can be very expensive.
Yeah.
So even though satellites are more expensive at the time I was visiting, I believe that probably there's a parity now. Do you agree?
I definitely agree. So a number of things have happened um, to make satellite communications more accessible. So yeah, I'm always talking about access and universal access. So one is the miniaturization of the components. With the whole digital world, the components have become much smaller and are really able to be much, much more performant. So you have a company like Planet who's literally putting, a smartphone into a little box and sending it up and being able to do a total map of the earth. You have telecommunication satellites which are such as Iridium, Starlink. They are much smaller. They are maybe well, we call them in units, but you have small sats and you have cube sats, which are like 12U. There's maybe 12U, just like about this, and all of this is helping tremendously. And then also the launch, because those satellites are much smaller and lighter, they are able then to go up cheaper. I always tell everybody when I do, people ask me to come and talk about investing in space. And I always say there are two things to remember. One, the bang for the buck. So how much money you're putting in and how much power and, and connectivity you're getting, and then using and defying gravity, using and defying gravity. So, because to send something up, you have to have a lot of power. But then you can bring it down and you don't have to have a lot of power. And you are also experiencing now, also with microgravity, the whole development with doing pharmaceutical experiments, and things like this. So that is one thing. But because of the miniaturization of components, then we're also getting much smaller launch costs. And indeed, this is one thing where I do agree with Elon Musk, and that he did do very well to really, bring together the everything to have reusable launches. However, I do also have to say that that technology was actually started by NASA and paid for by NASA.
So many questions I have for you, but if you put up all these satellites, even miniaturized components in the satellites, you're really flooding the sky, the heavens, as it were,
Yes.
with all these satellites. And there have been a number of commentators who worry about this. What do you do in the long term if everybody's putting up all these satellites?
Yeah. So this is something that I am very worried about on a number of levels. So the first, I'm the founding vice chair of North Star. We are the world's first space-based space situational awareness company, which means that we are in space and we are looking at space 360 degrees. So we identify and we track every object in space, which is very, very important. Because once you can identify and track those objects, then you can put into place what we call STM, space traffic management. And it's just like with cars. When you first had cars, everybody was just driving around, wherever they wanted to. But then you put into place stop signs, stoplights, directions. And so that is something that is being done right now. That is good. The second thing, though, is that unfortunately, and I call this the colonization of space in a bad way, is because two or three players, unnamed, will, but you can guess who, are basically taking the frequencies and the orbital positions away from what I call emerging spacefaring nations. So, countries that would like to use those frequencies and those orbital positions to do what they would like to do, not for what other people think that they should use their frequencies for. So this is something I'm fighting against at the moment, and I hopefully I am winning. I put together a code of conduct and a manifesto, and I'm working with emerging spacefaring nations. I've just become a member of the Singapore Space Think Tank for all of Southeast Asia to enable all of those countries to use space for their needs. This is something very, very important. And then the third thing is that people talk about the these, in particular, the LEOs, the low Earth orbit satellites, and that it's not a problem because you can bring them down to Earth, and when they come into the atmosphere, they burn up. But it is a problem because, of course, all of that burning up is contributing to the deterioration of our ozone. So this is really a big problem. And here again, you know, I'm not beholden to anybody. That's the nice thing about being an entrepreneur, is just saying, okay, this is wrong. You have to correct it. And so I'm on my little crusade. And I think I will win, because what's important is that we do have to keep, space clean, accessible, um, fair, equal access, so that everybody can use it also to combat the climate change, to help the environment, etc. So um, the more people who can join, the better.
There's so many things that are positive. I was very impressed with your discussion of the solar panels in space.
Yes.
That is a real knockout. And using the electricity that is generated with those panels for data centers, that solves a huge problem for the whole world. So there are some really, and of course, dealing with climate change and taking a look at the Earth and trying to figure out how we can better plan the future of the earth and humanity. This is the collaboration through science for peace. On the other hand, not everybody is into peace. Some people would like to use space technology for for violent ends, for ends that deprive people of freedom and information. And I wonder how you feel about that. There are countries that would cut off the rights of individual people to benefit by broadband through space, even though it's a fantastic resource. And they would try to stop that. They would try to prevent it. I'm not mentioning what countries, but I'm sure we both know what countries. And I wonder, if the international effort you're putting in, if
Mhm.
the creation of international institutions and structures to regulate, to monitor, to keep track of all the satellites and how people, nation states are using them, how successful you've been so far, and how you perceive that going forward.
Well, we have at that time, we only had founding fathers. So I have to say, the founding fathers of space. Today, we have a number of women, who are very active in space, and I'm thrilled about that. And just to show you, the director general of the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, is a woman, Doreen Bogdan Martin. The director general of the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs is a woman. So it's really really great. You know, so in the beginning these people came together and they did lay out laws. And there are two things happening. One, actually, the application of those laws is still something very valid that needs to be done. The rule of law on Earth and the rule of law in space, is the same. And whether that's competition rules, whether that's fair access, and following the rules. So this is something that we all have to try and fight for and adhere to. The second thing is that there is now, of course, some new challenges that require new laws. So, in the United States, we have our Constitution, and then we had the Bill of Rights. And so, it is something that I'm trying very hard to bring about. Um, a lot of people laugh, but that's okay. I've been laughed at so many times in my life, it doesn't matter. But there is the law of the sea, and the law of the sea is actually very, very similar to the law of space. And the United States did not sign the Law of the Sea Convention. And people have told me that they will probably not sign the law of a new convention for space. But even if they don't, a number of people believe that we should have an extended Bill of Rights or, convention. So I think that we need to work on this. And then I think the other thing that is very important and that a friend of mine is doing, the same one who's doing the internet, the spaceship, Helene Huby. She started the Carmen Fellowship. And every year, I'm a member of the jury. Every year, we choose young people 25, 30, 35 from around the world, from China, from Japan, from Russia, from South America, etc., to come together for 1 week and to talk about how they can use space for the betterment of our lives and the earth and the universe. And I think that if we get enough of those positive people, that next generation, then I think we will have this peaceful use of space. Yeah, only the impossible things are worth doing in life.
Touche. So only a few weeks ago, Vladimir Putin said that he had a new tactical nuclear weapon, and some of his drones were driven by fiber optic connections, and I guess that works through satellites
So
to do navigation. Is that what you were talking about when we mentioned fiber optics and the connection with satellites?
no, 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 no. What I was talking about was ground fiber optics because, when you have when you when you're sending a signal up, no matter what, you are connected to, to a data center or to, an IP center or whatever, and so, you need to connect that first connection from ground to earth. But once you have connected that, you can then use what we call intersatellite relays. And those are with free based optics. So, not with fiber, but with free based optics and optical communications. And um, those are becoming, and here again, Iridium was the first to use intersatellite links that were, that was in 1998 when we launched the satellite system. Um, so they're becoming more and more common because they allow, if you have an intersatellite link, then you don't have to go back to the ground. You can just keep on being in space the whole time. And also, I think what's important, I mean, yes, we do know about the possibility of using nuclear in space. We do know this. You know, we have always so far been able to use nuclear as the greatest deterrent to war. And so I believe we will continue, to do this. Um, the kind of exciting thing, though, that is happening just, with those data centers in space as well, is that we are starting to now um, do computing in space or what people call edge computing, so where you're not sending down everything that you have gathered, but rather already processing and computing and using AI on the satellites to have those actionable insights so that it's just those actionable insights that come down to the earth. And people talk about cloud, putting things in the cloud. Well, we have numerous satellite systems that are basically cloud based.
Truly above the clouds.
Yeah. So if you look at AWS, for instance, people, Amazon Web Services, it's total cloud. And I know that, um, with Jeff Bezos, that he is doing Kuiper. Um, my feeling, though, is that uh, the use of Kuiper will be much more to serve AWS and the AWS cloud than it will be to do telephony or things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, more will be happening in space. It's very clear from this discussion, but I wonder whether we saw on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago that there are weapons now that are completely autonomous,
Yes.
and there are no troops on the ground. There's no
Yeah.
boots on the ground in the modern concept of how war will evolve. But how will space evolve? You mentioned that in Europe they were designing a first European spaceship. Will
Yeah.
that have people? Will that have people, or will that be entirely automated?
So the first spaceship is focusing on cargo. So bringing cargo to the various space stations. So today. And by the way, we're not, here again, that defying and using gravity. All of the four space stations that the United States have the government has given money to, all of them are basically being built in space. So they're not being built on the ground and brought up. No, they're being built in space with using new materials, with using robotics, with using 3D printing, with additive manufacturing, all of this stuff. So I think that is one thing that is very important. Um, you know, the people talk about space tourism and colonizing Mars and all of this stuff. And about 2 years ago, um, Fortune did an article on well, they wanted to do it on me, but I said, don't do it on me. Do it on these 10 wonderful young space women entrepreneurs. And so, at an age when they could really take advantage of that, I got those 10 women into Fortune magazine, and I was absolutely thrilled. And at the end of the article, though, they say, to our great amazement, the only person that did not want to go into space of all of the women that we interviewed for this article was Candace Johnson herself. And, and I think that, I was thinking about this the other day because I was in Singapore and I was, and everybody, everybody was talking about how they had been inspired by Star Trek. But, you know, I was a generation earlier. So I wasn't inspired by Star Trek. I wasn't inspired, to do that. I was inspired by that little Sputnik and all of the things that satellite, could do for education, for entertainment, for telecommunications, for bringing universal access to people. And so I was a little bit different. So I'm not so into space tourism. I think that it has been helpful to inspire people, but I do hope that everybody understands that the real benefits of space are here when we use it correctly on Earth.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And with your organizations, will move ahead with that for sure. But you mentioned that some of the seminal technology came from NASA itself. NASA is a government
So,
agency.
yes.
And I was struck a couple of years ago when, I guess it was during the Biden administration, when Ukraine mounted an attack on Russian ships in the Black Sea or thereabouts, in Crimea, maybe. And they had autonomous boats with weapons. The Ukrainians did, and these required satellite navigation.
Yep.
And the navigation that was being provided came from Starlink, Elon Musk. But he decided that he didn't like that attack, that despite Biden's, public, rather national policy, he was going to stop that attack. So he turned off, uh, uh, you know, he turned off the satellite connection. And what struck me was I thought that the government, the United States government, controlled all this. Come to find, and your comments are completely consistent, that this is private in large part. This is private. It may be kind of nonprofit in one way or another. Institutional organizations, collaborative organizations, organizations that want to do the right thing. On the other hand, I'm not sure whether those organizations, what they would do if they disagreed with national policy, and such as conflict or no conflict. And I wonder how you feel about that. Should government have a greater role or a lesser role in what you are working on?
The first thing is government should not put all of their eggs in one basket. I'm sorry. You know, as I mentioned, SES, Astra, my satellite system, we have been providing high throughput broadband internet to Ukraine since 2001. Intelsat has been providing, high throughput broadband internet. Inmarsat has been providing uh, telecommunications, mobile telephony. Iridium has been providing. And all of a sudden, people just gravitated towards, Starlink as kind of the flavor of the month. And so I think that it is time and it is urgent that all governments look at not just one flavor, but they look at the huge, you know, spectrum that satellites can offer, and that they, and that they choose wisely. Every single satellite system, except for Starlink, has a board, corporate governance. If you do not, if you do not adhere to the rules of your board and to the rules of that nation, then you will be cut off. But you know, so I think the problem was really that the initial use of Starlink was not carefully thought through, and that this was quite frankly one of the discussions I was having with the World Bank this morning, is that you say, "Oh, fine, we can use Starlink for low Earth orbit, low latency. So it's not we're talking about milliseconds here, right? Okay, um, for certain things, but for other things, geostationary satellites such as SES, such as Pacific, such as Intelsat, etc., are much better. They are they do dedicated bandwidth. You remember I talked about that? Not shared bandwidth. So if something gets saturated, no, they have a dedicated bandwidth. They have SLAs, they have service level agreements. They say, we will provide you with 99.999% connectivity. We will adhere to the international rules. All of this has kind of been forgotten. So, this rule of law, we must have this rule of law. And we must have, nobody does sole source supplying, but the United States government was doing sole source supplying at one
Mm,
point, you know.
yeah.
So this has to change. And the more people who get educated to understand that there are Earth observation satellites, there are telecommunication satellites, there are satellite systems that are wonderful for schools, for hospitals, because they do have enough dedicated bandwidth to then be used by, 30 students or, 50, hospital beds or whatever, that these are resilient. Today, we talk about resilient communications. This is the most important thing, resilient.
Could the United Nations be helpful in this? Is it being helpful? It seems that we need a global organization.
Well, we have the International Telecommunications Union, which is a part of the United Nations. And the International Telecommunications Union um, um, allocates frequencies and orbital positions. And the only people who can ask for those frequencies and orbital positions are governments, sovereign governments. So when I started, SES in 1983, little Luxembourg, 400,000 people applied to the ITU to get frequencies and orbital positions. The United States does the same thing. But it, the International Telecommunications Union cannot tell that country who's applying what they should do or what they shouldn't do. That is why the convention the is something that is very important to say, these are the rules. This is the law of the sea. This is the law of space. How you use space is as important as getting access to space. So this is what we have to work on.
I wanted to ask you one more technical question that occurred to me when I was visiting PTC. At PTC, I kept seeing satellite phones, and the satellite phones were small. They could fit in one hand. And they were not that expensive, for a couple of $100, maybe a little more than that, but not much. You could buy a satellite phone, and then you could connect with the satellite system, and you could have a phone anywhere in the world at the top of Mount Everest, if you like. And I
Yeah.
said to myself, this has to be the future. Is it the future, or is it only limited to special situations?
So here again, it's a question of bandwidth. Um, so when we started Iridium, we started in 1984. We launched it first in 1988. Um, the idea of the Iridium people, I was not for this. It was primarily controlled by Motorola. And so Motorola, of course, was in the business of making mobile phones at that time. They were the number one in the world in 1988. Um, and so because when I came, I said, we must have competition in handsets. I do not want to work for monopoly. We must have competition in handsets. And so I brought Nokia to the table. And at the top level, Mr. Galvin, second level, Mr. Staiano, they were in agreement. The third level, the Motorola engineers would not give the specifications for the air interface to go from the satellite frequency to the mobile phone. And as a result, for years, Iridium only had one manufacturer, which was Motorola or Kyocera, who was working with them. What has happened now is basically what I had hoped would happen, but 30 years ago or 25 years ago. And that is that the mobile handset manufacturers are putting in place interfaces that can connect with satellite frequencies. And so, you know, um, you can there's a company called Skylo who basically has a phone that then can connect with any of these satellite systems, be they uh, uh, um, Inmarsat, Globalstar, Iridium, uh, you know, Starlink, etc. So this will be much more available and much cheaper. However, we must try. I am a techie, even though I'm not trained as a techie. I grew up as a techie. We must try, just as we consider oceans to be a limited resource. We, bandwidth in space is also a limited resource, and we must use it efficiently. And if there is another way to connect, then we should use that way and only use this space connectivity for telephony to when you can't use it, when you have no other connectivity.
Well, thank you very much for answering all my silly questions. I
No,
really
never a silly
appreciate
question. I'm so delighted. As far as I'm concerned, you've asked all the right questions.
it. I think that people want to know how to do what you've done. They want to know whether there's a place for them here in Hawaii to learn what you've learned, to be involved in the way you've been involved. It's a fantastic story you have, and I wonder if you could take a minute and sort of talk to them and give us your words, your comments to those young people.
Very, very happily. So, as I say, I am the luckiest person in the world because I grew up in this family where technology was omnipresent, but it wasn't the most important thing. It was a question of serving people, of making the world better, and et cetera. And I always tell everybody, I say, if you see a wrong and you think you can correct it and you have the expertise, then do so. So I'm the vice chair of the World Space Week, and this is a United Nations organization that celebrates every year from October 4th to October 11th, space education. And so and we have, I think, 104 countries around the world who use, who teach about space and what it can do to schools. And, you know, I would, I would urge every young person to do an experiment. Today you can build your own CubeSat. You can build your own rocket. You can go to the robotics club. Um, you can go to the telescope club. Now I know that here in Hawaii we are talking about the Mauna Kea telescope, but you know, as I said, there are many ways to skin a cat. So maybe you're not going to be able to use that telescope, but you can build your own telescope and you can do something just as good. I'm working with the Smithsonian Science Education Center, which also has the Smithsonian Observatory. And, we are talking about basically giving to every school a telescope, which may not be a physical telescope, it may be a remote controlled telescope. But being able to experience space and to see what you can do in space via telescopes is really, really great. Or as I say, by building your CubeSat or your rocket, um, or or doing an experiment like my young friend did to grow plants in these pods, on Earth and on the moon. So the main thing is to be inspired. I always quote Paul Éluard, the French poet, and in French he said, le poète n'est pas celui qui est inspiré, mais celui qui inspire. The poet is not he or she who is inspired, but he or she who inspires. And since I have been so fortunate in my life, and since I did have that aha moment, when I was 5 years old or 8 years old, when I was calling around the world, or 10 years old, when my dad came to my fifth grade class, I do understand the power of inspiration and the power of imagination. So go out there and trust yourself to do great things. I always say I choose my weapons. So my weapon is space to do great things. But, whatever it is that you believe you can really make the world a better place, just go and do it.
Oh, thank you, Candace. Let me say, c'est ça, c'est tout pour aujourd'hui.
Oh, très bien. OK, bah, c'est super. Your French is very good.
We'll have to leave it there.
Okay.
There's so much to learn here. And thanks so much to our guest, Candace Johnson of Seraphim Space Fund and so many other global organizations. I'm Jay Fidell. We've been engaging on creating networks for the universe. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Candace.
Aloha e mahalo.